Hello and welcome to our podcast. And we have a guest today, Bill Allen, William Allen officially, but I've known him as Bill. He has been all over the planet since we've talked, it seems like. So we're going to talk about what he's up to now and his aspirations, but he's been quite busy as a writer. So I welcome you, Bill, to the official podcast.
Thanks, Janice. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Glad you're here too, and we're cozy in our habitats with this weather we're having.
Absolutely. It's becoming winter all of a sudden.
It just dropped on us, I know, didn't it?
Sure did. Yeah.
Well, why don't you give our audience a little background of you, and then we'll go further into what you've been up to and what's going on.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, well, like you, Janice, I grew up in the Carolinas and moved out west in my mid-20s and started a career at Wells Fargo, I guess I can say that, and was in information technology. And that's really what I spent most of my life doing is information technology management, which was a good career. I enjoyed it, enjoyed meeting the people and the exposure. I was given to a lot of different things that I probably wouldn't have been exposed to before, but I always had a lifelong ambition of being a writer. And about 10 years ago, I decided to retire early to pursue other things. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, which I've never really used very much. And there's only so many things you can do with a bachelor's degree in psychology, but at least it's a good preparation for, I think, helping professions, even if you're not doing therapy. And when I retired, I decided to open up, took some classes, decided to open up what I call a hypno-coaching business here in Bend, and branched out from that and did neurofeedback brain training with a tool that I discovered, and Janice, you've used it before, which I really enjoyed doing. It was a wonderful business. I enjoyed meeting people. And as a result of doing that business, I've met a lot of people who fit a particular personality type that I have that I wasn't fully comprehending until after I had retired and gotten quite a bit older. But it was a personality trait known as sensory processing sensitivity or high sensitivity that about 30% of the human population has. And I was noticing a lot of the people that were coming in, especially for brain training, were much more sensitive to sort of turbulence in their lives and so forth. And the brain training really did seem to help, which I was glad to see. But it caused me to start wanting to investigate the personality trait. I knew about it. I'd read about it many years ago. Dr. Elaine Aron wrote a wonderful book called Highly Sensitive Person, which is kind of the genesis of and sort of encapsulates what the trait is. And I wanted to do research because as a highly sensitive man, it is not exactly something that I think culturally our culture encourages men to be sensitive. And this is a trait that we're born with. Um, and as I did research to kind of get to understand the trait, learn about the trait, I started writing a blog about it. And then after a few years, make a long story short, um, I wound up writing two books about the trait, Confessions of a Sensitive Man on Being a Sensitive Man. And it was a great opportunity for me to research and understand a little bit about myself, and at the same time, share my experiences as highly sensitive men in hopes that I would be able to share that with other men who have this trait. And here's the interesting thing about this particular trait. As I said before, 30% of the population has the trait, but of the people who have the trait, it's almost 50-50 men and women. So it's not just a trait you would think would be something you would see in the females. It is also a male trait as well. So there's lots to unpack about in and around the trait, but that's what led me to writing. And I have been doing podcasts like this one and talking about the trait, leading men's groups, and so forth to help other men who are discovering that they have the trait and then how to deal with some of the challenges that the trait presents to them. So it's been really a wonderful last couple of 5, 6 years doing this, and I've really enjoyed meeting people from all over the world um, who have the trait, and it seems like there's bonding and community that we're trying to form around the trait. And it's a lot about educating the people who have the trait, but also educating people who don't have the trait, who typically know somebody, either in their family or their friends, coworkers, or whatever, in their community that do have the trait. So the minute you start talking about it, they go, "Oh, I know somebody like that." So
Yeah.
it's good to be able to help people get their hands around what this is.
And that's fascinating. Of course, it's an in-depth subject. And so what do you, why don't you give just a little bit of an idea? Let's say I'm meeting somebody for the first time or getting to know somebody. What would be an indicator that someone, man or woman, might be a highly sensitive person?
Well, I'll tell you what, there are a few characteristics that you can tell that a highly sensitive person. There's four main characteristics that highly sensitive people typically have generally. And you got to understand it's a huge population, even though it's not the majority of people in the world, it's still over 1 billion people, maybe even closer to 2 billion people that have this trait. So when you have a large population like that, there's a lot of things that affect people's personality, and their behaviors and so forth. HSP, as we call it, high sensitive people, have the subset of traits, as I'm going to talk to you about in a second, but they also have other traits as well. So it's not the only thing that colors their personality. So it's the initial thing that I did when I first started writing about this was thinking, okay, we're all the same, but we really aren't, but we do share commonality. So the four things that highly sensitive people have is an acronym that Dr. Aaron has come up with called DOES, DOES. The first letter stands for depth of processing. Highly sensitive people are really good about taking in information, and they take in lots of information um, through, of course, sensory perception, and also through just being aware of things going on in their environment. But they do take it very deeply. They process it at a very deep level. That means that they churn it and go over it and over and over again. And sometimes it appears that they process things very slowly, and you kind of think, well, why can't you process quicker? Well, the reason is because that's our nature, is to be able to process deeply the information we get. The second characteristic is a tendency towards overwhelm and overstimulation, which is probably one of the most easily identifiable traits of a highly sensitive person if you're working with them. A lot of times, if there's a lot going on in the environment, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of busyness going on around them. Uh, Sometimes that can overstimulate a highly sensitive person. Now, that doesn't mean their sensory organs are hypersensitive. That's a completely different thing. But it's more if you think about it like a filter on a lens on a camera. The aperture opens up, you let more light in. Well, for highly sensitive people, we process a lot more data that comes to us. The other 70% of the population probably processes less because their filters aren't quite as open as highly sensitive people. But the tendency is you process more data, you're using up more bandwidth in your brain, and that can be overwhelming at times. And a lot of times, highly emotionally charged events and activities will also do the same thing for highly sensitive people. So they have a tendency to be overstimulated at times. And sometimes they'll say, look, I just need to be quiet for a while. I need to go be by myself or go out in nature or do something like that. So that's an indicator that you could tell that somebody might be highly sensitive. The third thing, the E stands for emotional reactivity and for empathy. Emotional reactivity, high sensitive people do tend to be very emotional. There is a connection between their uh, the size of their amygdala, which is an emotional part of the brain that regulates some of the emotion that goes on. And they tend to be much more emotional about things. Um, and for some people, that seems to be a problem, not necessarily for highly sensitive people. Other people think, well, you're just too emotional, you're too sensitive, whatever. But we're wired to be that way. And I think there's good reasons for that. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But emotions, you see, especially, say, for example, for a man, they might be moved at a beautiful sunset. They might be moved at a movie or a book or a piece of music, and you might see tears well up. Of course, they're also fighting through some cultural expectations that men are not supposed to be emotional like that. But highly sensitive people are just naturally more emotional. And they're also very empathetic. They say that we have mirror neurons. I don't know, we have more or whatever it is that causes that, but that mirror neuron reflects back what we're seeing in other people. That makes it so that we empathize more with other people. So that, you know, somebody may tell us a story or something, and we're picking up all the nuances of the information they're giving. So the tonality of their voice, the sort of the emotion that they're speaking with, and we relate to that, and that creates an emotional, empathetic bond with the other person. So we tend to be more empathetic than a lot of other people are. And finally, the last thing, the S, stands for sensing the subtle. This is what Dr. Aaron calls being able to pick up nuanced information from the environment. So if you couple that with the deep processing and with the ability to have a much more open filter, you can see why highly sensitive people sometimes can be overwhelmed easily. But they pick up things. I always use this example when I'm talking about this is you walk into a party with a highly sensitive person, and the highly sensitive person is going to be the one that's going to notice that there is a woman across the room with too much perfume on, or that there's too much bass in the music, or the hors d'oeuvres are too salty. They're going to notice these things that maybe other people aren't paying attention to. And that's always on with us. We're always paying attention to these subtle details. And as I was saying earlier, the reason for that, and Dr. Aaron calls it an evolutionary reason, is that a certain percentage of a population of people or animals, I mean, this trait surfaces in over 100 animal species as well, is to be that kind of canary in the coal mine, to know when to warn the other people in the population when something's not right, or to be able to ferret out where, food and water and so forth is. It's a survival thing that you
Oh,
have to have that kind of um, membership in a population so that you have those people that are more likely to be aware of things in the environment than more so than other people. And that's a good warning system for the population. So there is a reason for it. It's not a disorder and it's not a problem, except for the fact that our society is not really geared to working with specifically highly sensitive people. We have a kind of a go-go society that doesn't necessarily absorb the kinds of things that highly sensitive people do. So there are some challenges for highly sensitive people that they have to learn to deal with.
I would resonate with that. And being a coach as well, it that helps me understand some of the people I work with. And the overwhelm, I mean, I fall in that category. So I understand it. I understand the overwhelm and
Yeah.
the sensitivity. And I like the analogy, Bill, of the canary in the coal mine, because if we didn't have this population among us, we'd all be really messed up. I mean, we'd be super, I don't know, bumping into walls, and we've got problems as it is. But I think one of the things that you initially talked to me about when you were getting into this and telling me about it is the challenge that men have more than women with being highly sensitive. And I've been around highly sensitive men,
Right.
and including you, and I can see the challenge. I can see the cultural challenge being, I don't know if it's worse in the Northwest than it was in the South for you, but I can certainly see in the South, where I come from, the patriarchal man up, mentality that you struggle with versus a woman.
Absolutely. Of course, I grew up in the South too. And my both of my parents were Southern, so they had been indoctrinated into that kind of, the South is one of the most culturally traditional places in the country, and it's usually very conservative as well. Um, so being a sensitive boy, growing up in an environment, especially I was born in the mid 50s, and so growing up in the 60s and early 70s in the South, um, the message that was given to me was like you said, man up, uh, boys don't cry, uh, you don't ask for help, you can't show vulnerability, and all of these things that we were trained, and this is true, really, truly for almost all men in this culture, especially in the United States and in Western culture, is this idea that men are kind of almost robotic in how they work. They're supposed to weather every storm, they're supposed to know everything. And as you put it, the patriarchal sort of society that's built around that has men in charge, and expects men to know all these things and act as if they were uh, unemotional creatures and not affected by things, perfectly logical all the time, and that kind of thing. And it was tough. Being a sensitive child was not something I chose to be, but it was something I was born with. And so knowing that I was always having to sort of bite my lip when I was feeling hurt or upset or whatever, because I had to act like the part of the little man.
Yeah.
And, all fathers, I think, in the South are always admonishing their sons to be little men. Um, they're also doing a disservice to them, and I'm not talking just about highly sensitive men, but all men, and not allowing them to express that degree of vulnerability and that emotion that is natural to
Mhm.
all human beings. It's not just a female thing, it is a male thing as well. So, as highly sensitive men, especially now that I've come to realize that this is a trait and this is something I was born with, and that there's nothing wrong with it, is to be able to make sure that highly sensitive men understand that it's okay to be who they are. But also, I think the greater mission is to be able to help educate other men in understanding that the emotional side of them is a part of their humanity, and they should embrace it. Now, I'm not talking about breaking down and crying and falling apart and all this and having, emotional regulation needs to be done by everybody at some point or another. You need to be able to regulate your emotions. But when it's necessary and it's important to release that emotional tension, whether it's through tears or somehow expressing the emotion outwardly,
Mhm.
that's a necessary part of human uh, psychology. It's also very important for allowing us to release this energy that's inside of us that might be, spawned by this emotion that we're feeling. So yes, it is a challenge for a lot of men, especially for highly sensitive men.
Well, I grew up with a brother that he had epilepsy that developed, in his, I think he was 10 or 11, but he was a highly sensitive boy, and the epilepsy just really magnified that, I'm sure. But I can look back and he's passed recently, but he was always more sensitive and had more heightened emotions and his own children didn't get it. And as siblings, the younger brother is very manly and tough, that kind of thing. So there was a big contrast in the household.
No.
That and my dad, I don't know how to qualify him right now, but I'm not sure where he would fit in that. But yeah, having grown up with my older brother, definitely, even in sometimes more sensitive than I was, he
Yeah.
just, but part of that, the culture, I don't think we realize just how big a part that plays with people and how culturally diverse. But then you put somebody like yourself or my brother or any man that is highly sensitive in this culture that demands, certain behaviors. And not only that, but very judgmental of them and very condemning of, the whole scenario. Because, you know, in recent months, I've met a lot of men, I mean, they're into hunting and fishing and all that manly stuff that's considered manly from,
Mhm.
so so I look at that and go, are they programmed to be that way, or are they, so you have to really look at the
Yeah.
whole perspective, because if somebody's raised a certain way, but they're not naturally that way. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, let me just say, we were talking about hunting, fishing, camping, doing the things that men typically have been sort of conditioned to do. And realizing too, here's the thing about this. One of the things that I've been promoting over the last couple of years is an expansive, inclusive masculinity that includes the great variety of men that are out there. I know a lot of, and this is true of a lot of highly sensitive men. There is a trait called high sensation seeking highly sensitive people. It seems to not go together, but they really do. And about 30% of highly sensitive people also have this trait as well. That would lend them to doing things that are a little bit more risk taking, right? So things that might be considered more quote unquote manly, some highly sensitive men do that naturally. And I don't fault anybody for, if men like doing what they do, and traditional masculinity too has its place as well. I'm not against that. That's not what I'm saying. Um, and I want to make sure the men understand that it has its place. But sometimes traditional masculinity can turn itself on men, right? And become somewhat toxic by not allowing them to be the full human being that they are. So yes, there is cultural conditioning that takes place. I do think there are some men who are more prone to say, hey, look, they like going outdoors. They like hunting. They like fishing. They like doing traditional things. Maybe they like roughhousing and all that kind of stuff, but not all men are that way. And that there's not a gradation of men. If you think about it in the great scheme of things,
Mhm.
you're more manly if you do those things, and you're less manly if you don't. I think men are, first of all, human beings first, and the way we express ourselves is as infinite as the human genome is. Um, it's going to be expressed in a lot of different ways. But I think the thing that I would really want to emphasize here is the cultural stuff that we're indoctrinated with that I think is not good. And this happens very often for boys when they're babies. There's been studies that show that parents very often will let the boy cry in the crib a little bit longer than they do for the female baby because they don't want the boy baby to be sort of conditioned to be soft or whatever, right? They're not encouraging the crying part of it. And it's really kind of sad because it's a cultural bias against men that way. So the idea is that it starts very young for a lot of boys, and that culture gets compounded. And when they get to the age where they're going to school, they meet up with peers who have already got their little man cards, right? And so they kind of produce their own peer pressure to make sure that men conform to this particular code. And again, there are some things about traditional masculinity, excuse me, I think are great. A man wanting to be a protector of his family, I think it's a wonderful thing. Women can do the same thing as well, but if a man feels compelled to protect his family, as he should, that's a
Mhm.
good thing. If he wants to feel like he's providing for his family, these are all things about caring, nurturing, and making sure that the family succeeds. So those kinds of characteristics are good,
Mhm.
right? But we tend to get them out of whack, especially when you start talking about patriarchal societies where, the idea is that men and women are not considered equal members in a family. And what happens is the pressure becomes sitting squarely on the father or the man's shoulders. And a lot of times he's not prepared to be able to handle that. So the idea is that these traditional patriarchal cultures don't recognize the value, the absolute value that women bring to the equation, and the fact that a man and a woman in a traditional relationship, not necessarily the only one that's out there, um, is they complement each other, as all partners do, right? So that's the thing that I think I would probably emphasize. The idea is to be mindful of how the culture has affected, if you're a man, how it's affected your behavior. If you find yourself not able to express emotion or feeling or vulnerability or anything that makes you feel less than manly, I would question that.
Yeah,
I would ask myself, am I doing this simply because that was the way I was socialized to be? Or am I doing it because I really want to be, acting on that kind of cultural cue? So it's
yeah,
something that we all need to examine. In the discussions I've had over the years, there's I think, a movement afoot. Is not necessarily coming necessarily from a highly sensitive men's point of view, but we certainly support it. Is this idea of an expansive definition of what masculinity is, and that the idea that there is no one size fits all, and very often because we're all different, um, we should be able to feel comfortable in being authentic to who we are.
absolutely. And I thank you for addressing that because that is a really vital point that we need to, and we could talk about this for hours. We got about 5 minutes before, you know, we get the boot here. So I want to visit what your current project is, if you can not
Sure.
elaborate, but just touch on it, just a teaser, because it's going to be awesome. I know a little bit, so why don't you just give us a taste of what you're up to now?
Well, I'm writing a book, and it's a little departure from the other books that I wrote. It was a nonfiction. The two other books are nonfiction, of course, and they talked about my experience as a highly sensitive man. But I thought, and in my book, one of the original books that I wrote, I had sort of said we need more characters, we need more heroes, highly sensitive men heroes. So I'm writing a book right now about a man on a spiritual quest, if you will, finds himself at a certain point in his life where he's looking for meaning and so forth, and he happens to be a highly sensitive man. Now, the premise of the book isn't about high sensitivity per se, but he, as a character who is highly sensitive, and he goes on this long and wonderful journey. He meets some remarkable, wise women who become his mentors and help him to sort of discover his spiritual and his natural purpose in life. And he finds a degree of happiness as a result of this journey. It's kind of a hero's journey. I think the thing that I have, the closest thing I can come to is what is it like? Well, it's probably kind of like the Celestine prophecy in some ways, but also kind of like a hero's journey as well. So um, I'm about midstream and finishing it up, and I'm real excited about getting that done and getting it out there for the public.
Well, if you need a reviewer, you know who to reach out to.
I'll definitely do that.
I will definitely love to review the book. So we will definitely provide the information on how to contact you. Just briefly, is there a website or I know you'll give this to me, but just do you want to verbalize it real quick? And
Yeah, the very best way is to go to my website. It's called thesensitiveman.com, one word. And that's got all my links there to social media, to my blogs, everything. It's all in one place.
well, perfect. I'm gonna slip my glasses on so we can stop the recording and then you and I can wrap it up. This has been wonderful, and I just hope the audience gets so much out of it, and you'll hear from people with more questions, no doubt. So I'm going to end the recording. Thank you for joining us
Thanks,
again,
Janice. Yeah.
Bill Allen, and enjoy the recording.